up in San Diego, and in San Diego, first off, I got to preface this. I'm a Navy brat. Okay, that means my father was in the U.S. Navy. My mother was, I think, working in, I don't know if it was a restaurant or a bar, but she was working somewhere in Yokosuka, Japan, and that's where my natural father was stationed. And he was Jeffrey Clark, actually not Jeffrey Clark, Roy Clark, excuse me, Roy Clark. And Roy Clark met my mother, Mitsue, and they fell in love, got married, and she brought her back to America, to San Diego, and he was stationed at the base in San Diego, and I was born in the Naval Hospital there. Okay, that's how I got to America. She got to America, and why I was born in America, in the Navy housing there in National City. So after that, my mother, she got a job working as a waitress at a Japanese restaurant, and it was the best Japanese restaurant in town. And my father, tragically, he died when I don't have very many memories of him, because he died when I was 2 years old. And so my first stepfather, Sam Hendrick, he married my mother when I was 4 years old. And so I took his name because he was the father who raised me. Okay, and both Sam and Roy were veterans in the service. Navy for Roy. Sam was a Air Corps, you know, back in World War II. He was a lieutenant, he was a pilot. And so I have that little background working with me about being around that. But when I was raised in San Diego, being in Claremont, I was one of the very, very few people in that little community that was not white. It was a predominantly white area, and I remember when I was young that it didn't, I know I don't look very Japanese now, but back then I looked more Japanese. I don't know what it was something in the eyes or a few other things, but I remember times getting heckled by the kids saying, you know, using the words yellow, Jap, you yellow Jap, you shouldn't be here, and things like that, because you know, it's a Navy base there, and it's a lot closer to Hawaii and Pearl Harbor, and a lot of people still had a lot of very negative feelings about the Japanese.
What time was this that you were growing up?
This was we're talking born in 57, so it was the time I was being heckled and everything else was like first grade was in 1961, 1962, 63, 64, 65, in the mid-60s.
Yeah.
I mean, that kind of discrimination kind of went away as I was growing, because my features were changed some. Mm-hmm. I looked less Japanese, and I'd made friends, and that kind of discrimination still remained from people who I didn't know if I would walk around the neighborhood and stuff. You know what I mean? Not in school.
Do you feel like those experiences shaped how you grew up, or sort of how you saw other people that you were living near?
I think so, very much so, because it helped me to understand and appreciate differences in people, and appreciate diversity some, and understand what's going on. Also, another thing that happened when I was growing up was Sam was Lutheran, and my mother she'd been Japanese and born in Yokosuka, Japan. She was a Buddhist. And I remember Sam wanted me to be as American as possible, and have the best education and get the best grades. And what ended up happening was when I was like 7, either 7 or 8 years old. My report cards were coming in from elementary school, and my lowest grades were always in English. And my father, Sam, he didn't like that. He couldn't stand that. And so he told my mother, he says, no more Japanese in the house. And he says, she was very upset by that. And then they kind of came to a compromise. And he says, okay, only in the kitchen at the kitchen table. Anywhere else, no Japanese. You have to start speaking to him in English because he's got to learn better English. And so that's when I started getting away from being fluent in Japanese, because she raised me speaking to me a lot in Japanese, and I was a pretty smart kid, so I had both languages when I was little, but that went away as I grew older. A little sad about that, but anyway, she knew that there was places to do things. Like kitchen was where to speak Japanese. Right next to the kitchen was another room, and my father called it the Japanese room. Okay, that's where all the Japanese ornaments and the dolls and other things could go. And if we ever wanted to do, and there was a table in there where if you wanted to do the traditional Japanese dining, you could sit on the floor and eat off of the table on the floor. And the legs were, it's kind of hard to explain. The legs were kind of like this and this and this and this. And when they swung out, the table could pop up. So that was a Japanese room. And it was a red Formica top on the table. And there was the dolls in there, Japanese dolls in their fancy cases, very expensive ones. I remember that. You know, my mother, very traditional Japanese, because she worked at the Japanese restaurant, and when she went in there, they had Japanese rooms in there. And she wore obi in the sash and everything. So she kept pretty strong to her Japanese traditions, and she was well liked. Like, she was one of the senior waitresses there, so the other ones kind of looked up to her and everything. And I could see that right away, you know, because when sometimes they won't be able to find a babysitter for me, so she brought me into work. I would always get Shirley Temples from the bar and hang out with the people, and I could tell they respected her a lot there. She was very well respected there, but she didn't get that same respect from my father, my stepfather. You can tell he kind of was controlling things, and it got to the point where the Buddhist temple was almost off limits, because we used to go to the bazaars and everything, and that was a lot of fun. But he didn't like the idea of doing that, and he was Texas Lutheran, Dutch background. That's where Hendrick comes from. He's very, very tall man, very intimidating. As a matter of fact, he was 6'4". So you didn't mess with Sam. But he was also very charismatic too. He was I knew that growing up, I could tell how he wooed my mother. Let's put it that way. Later on, but so I had that dynamic going on in my house, the cultural thing, and but it got to the point where when I was 12 years old, my mother and father had already decided they were going to get divorced. But because divorce was kind of frowned upon back then in the 60s, more so than now, they decided they were going to stick it out. And they told me that they were going to stick it out until I turned 16, because they didn't want to have to fight over who had custody of me. So they were leaving it up to me to which one to live with. And that kind of tells you a little bit about my background and everything with my family. It was an unusual background in that regard. It wasn't anything but a traditional family.
Yeah. How would you say that sort of juxtaposition between that Lutheran Dutch background and your mom's Buddhist background, like how that maybe affected your views on religion, or have you seen faith play a role in your life today?
That's a good question. Back then, my father Sam, he didn't go to church regularly, but like I said, he didn't want me being associated or being a part of the Buddhist temple. The Buddhist church which is actually on the other side of town too. So we were in the northern part of San Diego. So so I wasn't very religious early on, and as I grew up, I kind of grew because I saw my friends. A lot of my friends were going to church and everything, so I'd give it a shot, give it a try once in a while. Some of my best friends were, and I went to some Protestant churches for off and on, once in a while, but I didn't really become a member of a church until, and I remember this very well, until 1992. In 1992, the reason why that happened was I lost my job. I lost my job I was down in San Diego, so I was looking for employment. I didn't have my bachelor's degree. So I came back up to LA. My mom moved up to LA and she'd ordered a divorce and everything. And she remarried Jimmy Kawasaki, my second stepfather. And Jimmy Kawasaki, I really grew to like him and respect him over the years. And Jimmy was a member of a Calvary Baptist church. And it was an interesting thing about that church is that made it very accommodating. It was in Gardena, California. They used to have on one side, just like, you know, nowadays we have these traditional and contemporary or whatever, which is the modern. Well, they had Japanese and English services with the two different pastors in the Baptist church, Calvary Baptist Church. So that was an opportunity for me to actually get closer to my mom again, because my mom became Christian and she would go and attend on the Japanese side with Jimmy, and I'd go to the American side. And that was 1992, 93, 94. But that all kind of fell apart on June 1st, 1994, because Jimmy passed away. He got prostate cancer and passed on. And we went through some rough times after that, and that's religion in a nutshell for you. Is that? But well, I'll take that back. When I was in not when I was in graduate school, because I did, you know, in graduate school sometimes you don't have time or don't feel you have time. It gets very stressful. So I didn't go to church in graduate school, but after graduate school, I valued the community and the Sunday school and the connections I made when I was back at the Calvary Baptist. So I thought I'd try out the Baptist church when I got my job in the South in Jacksonville, Alabama. And the Southern Baptist church there was a lot different than the Calvary Baptist church that I remembered or in California. And so one service was all I could take, and I said, no, this isn't for me. But luckily, like I said, I had a job. It was one of my first jobs as a professor, but the people across the street from me were professors too. And one of them said, hey, Jeff, why don't you come and attend our church? I think you'll like it better. It was First United Methodist. And I've been a First United Methodist ever since.
Yeah, thank you for being willing to share that with us. You had mentioned Jimmy, your second stepfather, and your mom would sit on the Japanese side. Was he from Japan as well? Was he Japanese?
Good question. Jimmy was very unique and different, and it helped me to understand the culture, some of the culture and the oppression that went on. Him and his family grew up in Gardena, and he was, I believe his family was from Japan, and they, you know, placed in Gardena and Torrance. And him and his family, his brothers and sisters, he had a lot of brothers and sisters, and his mother and father, my grandmother, step-grandmother and father, they I got to know them a little bit as I was growing up. He married my mother when I was 21, and I know exactly when he married her because he married her on my birthday when I turned 21 in Las Vegas. That's just to tell you a little bit more about how unusual my relationship was. My mother and Jimmy got the idea, go to one of those Elvis chapels and kill two things with one stone, as the story goes. You know, oh, we can give Jeff his birthday present, and we can get married at the same time, and he can be our witness. So so I remember that. So that's when I first met Jimmy. And over the years, I got to know Jimmy, and we started talking about things. And I remember in 1991, or is it 1991 or 92? It was either 91 or 92, 92 probably. 1992, he said, come on, Jeff, you're going to enjoy this. And we took a trip, me, my mother, and him. And he wanted to make sure I came along. We went to Arizona, and it's because that's where he had been put in one of those internment camps. He'd been put in an internment camp in Arizona, and they were having their 50-year reunion of the graduating class, because he actually graduated from high school when he was in internment camp. It was in one of the really small towns, like in Tombstone or Prescott, I don't know where, somewhere around there. But I remember meeting some of his old classmates, and they talked about growing up, and they really liked Jimmy and remembered him very fondly, even though he was Japanese. I think he was only Japanese. There was one or two Japanese kids that were one in his class, and a couple in another below him, and I think 25 white kids that graduated. And of the 25, like only 6 or 7 of them were there for the 50 year. And it was a unique experience to meet them. And I remember another thing that we did when we were there. Another thing that surprised the heck out of me was they took me out one day, and we just started playing with guns and shooting them in the air. And you know, in Arizona, it's okay.
So you'd mentioned Jimmy's experiences in the Japanese internment camps.
Yes.
Did he share that? Did he share any of those stories with you?
Yeah, he did a few of them. It was he said he said well, one thing that he did share, and this is that when they got out of the internment camp and came back to Gardena, you know, all their property was gone. I guess that's a motion sensor. You might want to. Yeah, but anyway, what was going on was when they came back, him and his family got released and everything. They'd all lost all their property, and they lost everything, and they all basically had to start over, and it was really rough. And he mentioned that this is one of the reasons why. I mean, a lot of people don't understand it that well, but the Japanese have a very strong what they call the Nisei society. Mm-hmm. You know what the Nisei stands for?
The second generation.
Second generation.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, they're very strong. It's a very strong organization, and he was a part of that, the Nisei society, and he was one of the active members. And he told me that's one reason why we had to have that, Jeff, because back then we were all just helping each other out and get back on our feet and everything, because we didn't have anything. Yeah. And he told me he had a very difficult time getting back into the workforce and getting employed anywhere. I think one of the jobs he said that he had initially was a dog groomer. And I love dogs, and he loved dogs, and I was wondering why he had all this clipping equipment and everything, you know, in the 90s. And he said, oh, that's from back in the day, Jeff. I did that for several years. That's how I made money. That was my living. And after being a dog groomer, most of the rest of his family, a lot of the people were in landscape and gardening, and maybe that's one of the reasons why they got stereotyped for that, because it was just because they were very good at it. It was the only reason. And they cared about the plants and cared about the stuff. Yeah, it helped me to understand how some people might look at other people. All these things. Some people might look at other people and say, "Oh yeah, I know you're Japanese because you're a landscaper," or "I know you're this because of that." You know, the people develop these preconceptions and everything else, and they don't think that people could ever be anything but that. But I know Jimmy was a very bright young man, and he persevered through graduating in internment camp. So I looked up to him so much, and so did my mother. And my mother was crushed when he died of the cancer. And that's when my life changed. I had to take Jimmy's place a little bit. Yeah, that's when I grew up. It was in 1994. When I realized there's nobody else, because I'm an only child. There's nobody else to take care of my mother but me. You know, I thought it was going to be Jimmy. And no, role reversal. That's a first of two eulogies that I had to give, because she couldn't give Jimmy's eulogy. She was too broken up by it. And she tried to commit suicide a few times. And it's okay for me to tell you this now, because she died in 2015. I had to bury her, and that was the second eulogy I had to give. And that was, when she died, my last living blood relative in the United States was gone, that I knew, because I didn't have any contact with Roy and Roy's family. And Sam had passed on. He died of cancer, lung cancer, in 1991, even though I didn't know about it. But funny thing, Sam was a driving force in my life, even though people might say, just from, you know, if they're watching this, they might say, "Man, that Sam was a really hard-nosed guy, and he was really mean to your mother, and he really didn't, you know, he's culturally insensitive." Well, another thing that Sam did was, when I was 25 years old, he kicked me out of the house after I dropped out of school. And so we lost contact with each other, because I kind of always hated him for that, you know. And if anyone want to know why I dropped out of school, I fell in love. I was at USC, and I was in the summer term. Bad decision of mine. I was working for IVAC, medical electronics, and I decided to drop out because I didn't know what I wanted to do. I was at USC getting an engineering degree, and engineering wasn't my thing. So I went ahead and dropped out, did that, and when I dropped out, that didn't make my father happy at all. And when I was just, he saw me as just vegetating around, and he was trying to force me to go back to school. And so that's why he kicked me out. And I also, there was another thing going on with me. When I was a little kid, I was diagnosed with epileptic seizure disorder. So the epileptic seizure disorder made for times when I would get depressed, and it made for times when I would wonder, well, why do I even bother, you know? Because nobody cares about me, and I'm not going to do anything anyway. I'm probably not going to be here much longer. And that was my attitude for quite a number of years. And it wasn't until I was in my late 30s or 40s, in 1994 especially, when I matured and got over that and went back to school, got my bachelor's, then my master's at Temple University, then my PhD at Bowling Green State University in communication, mass communication. And now I'm a teacher. I'm a professor. I've been teaching for 14 years.
That's amazing. You had mentioned your stepdad and sort of that cultural pushback of sort of subduing the Japanese cultural heritage that your mother brought into the house. Do you feel like, as an adult, that has affected any part of your identity as a Japanese man, Japanese American man?
Yeah, maybe in the reverse sense. whenever I fill out any application or anything like that, when they ask me what nationality I always check Japanese. I don't even think about it, even though I'm half Japanese, half Caucasian. I identify with the Japanese side because I'm not going to forget about it. Because one of the things I swore when I was young is I wasn't going to do what my father did. And like I said, I held it against him for kicking me out when I was 25. And when I got back in school and got my bachelor's and I got my master's in 2002 at Temple. When I got my PhD, I tried to look out for him because we'd been out of touch for so long. And it wasn't until 2005 when I was getting my PhD that I figured out that he died 14 years before. And he was the one that was pushing me. He said, you know, I'm going to show Sam. I'm going to show Sam that he was wrong. That I could amount to something and everything else. And well, I guess I didn't get that opportunity. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. You speak of Sam like a major influence in your life. Are there any things you feel like you've carried with him that were sort of an impact of his life on you?
All the time. He taught me, like I said, he raised me, and he taught me, he made me very, what do you call it, technologically literate, and he had a stereo system, this big stereo system, and we were the only people, believe me, maybe the only people in all San Diego who had Voice of the Theater speakers in our living room. Okay, this is the big stereo. This wasn't any kind of stereo, you know. And in 1960, having a stereo was something, you know what I mean? But this was a big stereo, just like having an early 60s, having a color TV was really something. We had both in our living room. My father, Sam, he was one of those. Like I said, he was charismatic, and a lot of people loved him. When I brought him for the Father Day, you know, and everything else, he worked in the electronics industry for Ryan Aeronautical. He worked for the space, the lunar lamp, the lunar module, and he'd always bring gadgets and stuff and everything else. You know, he was one of the highlights. I mean, it's just like the firemen are kind of like highlights. Well, he was having all the space stuff because everybody, you know, back then everybody wanted to be an astronaut or wanted to be a pilot. Yeah, and he was both, kind of a pilot, and he had in the aerospace industry. So, you know, I mean, as much as I might have resented him a little bit later on in my life, I loved him. I loved the man, and I loved him with all my heart because he taught me things like, several years ago, I noticed there was a group of speakers that was online for sale at in surplus store, in a surplus pawn shop. In a pawn shop, it was online, and I found them, and they were called Trip 9s, and the Trip 9s from Kenwood speakers were ones that the soldiers used to buy. And there was big speakers, and they had a 16-inch woofer in them. And I was wondering why they were only $50. So I went to them, and I went ahead and bought them. And one of the woofers was broken. That's why. One of the woofers needed replacing. And so I just went online the internet, found the 16-inch woofer from an Altec Lansing Voice of the Theater speaker, and I replaced it because I knew how, because of Sam. All of that's another thing that he taught me, you know, soldering iron, all other thing, using electronics. I have him to thank for all that, because he made me what a lot of people say, that they oftentimes say, oh, Jeff, he's a handyman, he's Mr. Fix-It, he knows how to do all that. That's because of Sam. It's not because of anything else but Sam.
Growing up in the mid-'60s, you know, at the height of the civil rights movement, did you feel like you experienced prejudice growing up then, or experiences now? Do you feel like you experienced prejudice or discrimination? Even though you had
Funny,
mentioned-
back then, yes, some, especially when I was young. Discrimination, but what was even worse was when I was in my 20s and 30s, and I was thinking about, especially when I was in 30s and 40s, I was thinking about getting into school. What ended up happening, because I was putting Japanese on my application to get back into school, when I thought about getting back into school, is in California, especially in Los Angeles and in San Diego, especially Los Angeles, there was a reverse discrimination because they had so many Japanese applicants that were qualified that the fact that I'd been out of service for a while, that's what I'll call it, that I dropped out, worked against me. And because I was, and they said, oh, no, and especially UCLA. Oh, we already have so many at UCLA. You know, yeah, you're not getting in our school. And so that made me wonder a little about what's fair, and helped me to understand when some people talk about you couldn't get into that school because because you were a woman, or because you were African American, or because you're that. Well, I can say I've been there, done that, because it wasn't a pleasant experience. My trying to argue, or hey, you need me. I don't care what you say about all those other Japanese. I'm Japanese American. I'm special, and I got Sam in me, but you aren't going to listen to that, right? Mm-hmm.
So do you feel like that sort of shaped your educational experience, trying to go back into school and finding that pushback?
Yeah, to some degree, because the state of California actually helped me out when I was helping my mother out through her depression, and she got suicidal tendencies, and I had to move back in with her, give up my job. I just found a new job then. It was in 1994, and I just found a new job. And my mother tried to commit suicide, and the Torrance Medical Center said, we aren't going to let her out because it's the second time this has happened unless you move back in with her. So I had to move back in with my mother, and she was a handful. She was bipolar, manic depressive, and with the suicidal tendencies. Back then, I still loved her, but I had to do that. It was my obligation. I was all that she had, and I knew that at the time too. But it made it more difficult for me to try to search for a school. So the only school I could go to was the one that was 3 or 4 miles away, because I couldn't stay. So that's why I enrolled back in Cal State Dominguez Hills. And at Cal State Dominguez Hills, I also started to appreciate diversity, because if you look up the population, student population at Cal State Dominguez Hills, and well, I think some of you probably already know. I know the young lady in the back. She knows. You know Serena Williams? Yes. Yeah, she's from Compton. Compton's right next to Carson. Carson is where Cal State Dominguez Hills is. It's a neighboring suburb, and it's funny how in Los Angeles, it's not a soup and everything gets mixed together. It's more of a salad bowl, and they got your other little areas around, like, oh, there's a concentration of the African Americans here, there's a concentration of whites here, there's a concentration of Koreans here, and da-da-da-da here. And even you could even see it in the mini malls and everything else, where people would, and Los Angeles had a Japanese town, and it had a Koreatown, and had a Chinatown. And I just love going to Japanese town, of course, because best food. And so a lot of people think, oh, no, America is, they're very open, and everybody integrates, and we don't have any segregation. And I said, not true. It's not true. I mean, it's now it's become voluntary. Voluntary segregation is what it's turned into. And I even knew that when I moved back in with Jimmy and my mother after I lost my job. I made a good friend, Bernardo. Shout out to Bernardo, Mexican American. And anyway, when I moved in with him, we moved into an apartment together in Inglewood. And this is the funny part about this story. It's because that was back in the time when they had the race riots were going on, and Colors, the movie Colors, and the gangs. Bernardo warned me not to go past a certain street. And if you cross that street, you can get in trouble. You might get in trouble and you might get harassed or hanged. And he warned me initially that I might not fit in with the Hispanic people either, because the Hispanic people were in the one area of Inglewood, and the African Americans, I think it was Inglewood Drive or something, or Inglewood Boulevard was at what time, and then it became, it's like the turf, the territory. But I learned one thing right away. All I had to do was grow a mustache, and everybody thought I was Hispanic. Okay. Yep.
Do you feel
problem solved?
Yeah. Do you feel like being sort of right in the middle of such divided cultural hubs like that, played a part on how you saw different cultures and different people groups, and then being here in Texas, like have you seen sort of
Texas,
similarities with
Texas, especially East Texas and Marshall, it was culture shock for me. I couldn't believe that a town that I was seeing a town that was that segregated, and it was even more segregated back in the day. Maybe even California. I mean, like I said, back there, a lot of the segregation was kind of voluntary, and it was just, undrawn lines, a lot of it. I'm not saying that everybody was that way, but oftentimes you saw it that way. But in Marshall, it's half African American and half white, and yeah, you know which side of town is which. The west side of Marshall is African American, and the east end is and the Hispanics are kind of moving in and take over a little bit in the northwestern sector for the most part. And even the cemeteries are segregated and everything. The cemeteries for the African Americans, the cemeteries for the whites, and when I went to my church the first time when I moved there in Marshall, First United Methodist Church, one of the guys there was a really nice guy. He was a retired judge. He named Jim. He invited me to lunch with him, and the lunch he took me to the country club. Talk about an all-white place. No, I said, wow, yeah, it's in a town that's supposed to be 50-50, but the country club wasn't anywhere close. So, that was it's different. East Texas and Texas, much different, and helped me to understand a lot more about what people were saying when they said, oh, you don't know what I went through. You don't know what it was like for me. Well, now I'm starting to understand it after I've that. And like even in the movie, oh boy, I got to do the motion sensor again. Even in the movie, have you seen the movie about Wiley College called, no, you haven't seen the movie?
I don't think so.
Denzel Washington movie?
What's it called?
You know what it is?
It depends. What is it called?
The Great Debaters.
Oh yeah, I've seen it. It's such a good movie.
Yeah, The Great Debaters. If you see The Great Debaters, boy, you can see the racial tensions and the racial everything in that movie. And I know it's true now because I got to know some historians, and the historians were telling me about the two hanging trees in Marshall. One of the this compromise was made, and they cut down one of the hanging trees, and they wanted to leave out the other one up for historical purposes. It's an oak tree or something, and it's on the campus of ETBU. And one of the ways why I got introduced to that is one of my advisees was going onto the ETBU campus, and she was dressed in her regalia and her robe there. It's a really nice, beautiful campus. And she was going around in front of trees and everything else, and Dr. Hicks was telling me, does she know that that's the hanging tree that she's, that she's posing in front of? And everything. I said, what? And I said, yeah, we still have one. That was a compromise that was made, and that, you know.
You spoke earlier about sort of your experience of being at least partially cut off from Japanese culture.
Mm-hmm.
Could you speak a little bit about maybe the role of community in holding on to cultural heritage or something, or things like that?
I've learned in America the community is very important, and I've identified. I think that, and that's one reason why I'm a member of the First United Methodist Church. It's more for the communityship and with the members in the church than for anything else. And I strongly value and feel it's needed. It's a necessary, at least for me. I don't know how you feel about it.
Mr. Hendrick, I really appreciate you coming out and speaking with us today. Was there anything else that you wanted to touch on that we didn't get a chance to cover? Anything else you wanted to say? No,
I don't think so.
Okay.
I just wanted to share my thoughts as a Japanese American that's been around the country, and even though I'm a professor at Wiley College, my students are always telling me that, at least initially they were telling me, oh, that's my cell phone, I'm sorry. My students were always telling me that, oh, Dr. Hendrick, you don't know what's going on with us, and you don't know that. And I said, are you sure? You don't? And I don't understand, and I don't know, and hardly know. There's no way you could know, because their take on it was, oh, there's a Japanese or Japanese American kid. He's always had everything he wanted, and he always had the easy way through, had the privilege and easy way. But it isn't necessarily that way. Not everybody takes the easy road, and I know my road had some little bumps and struggles for it. And one of the things I try to teach all my kids is you got to fight. You got to fight for yourself. You got to earn your way, and you got to fight for things. It's not going to come down out of the sky to you. You got to go out and grab it and get it. Fight for it.